Hey, I'm Emma Garlett and welcome to Paint It Blak. This week I have such a special episode. I'm here with Professor Andrew Gunstone, who's over from Melbourne, and he's here to talk a bit about reconciliation and his journey. He's a founder of the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice, and I have the pleasure of sitting on Andrew's advisory board at the centre as well. So welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Emma. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me over in Perth. It's not the greatest weather, so thanks for trekking it in.
I was expecting it to be a bit hotter, but there you go. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so one big area that's so important and, you're a leader in this field is you're an Aboriginal ally and you've been doing it for years. You're an editor of a very significant journal that we have in this country, and you're in a significant leadership position as well. So could you tell me a bit about your journey?
Sure, Emma. Like many people my age and probably people a bit younger, I went through schooling knowing very little about Indigenous issues. The only things I learned about Australia were Captain Cook, Farlap, Don Bradman and Ned Kelly. So I learnt very little. Then when I was at university doing law, I was looking around for some other subjects to study. And my mothers always know best, she said, I reckon you'd be interested in learning about Indigenous studies. And she was exactly right. So I started studying Indigenous studies under Professor Eve Feasel at the Monash Indigenous Centre. And liked that so much I dropped law and kept going with Indigenous studies and just kept studying and getting various jobs around at different universities and been here. I'm one of those sad people that liked university so much I never left, and I've been here as an academic many years later. So yeah, really credit to my mum for having that foresight all those years ago to suggest I study Indigenous studies. So that's how I really got into the area.
Yeah. And just around your journey in this space as well, how has it been? Has it changed a lot for you? I could imagine when you first started and you were studying at Monash compared to now, you've seen so many different law reforms, initiatives, proposals for treaty, Reconciliation Victoria, which you're a co-chair of as well, all the amazing work that you're doing there. There's been so much that's happened in this space, and even the failed Voice to Parliament referendum as well. And you held panel discussions around the country for that as well to advocate for a yes vote, which was unfortunate that it didn't pass. So have you seen a lot of changes?
There's been enormous changes. So I think for most of the first part of my career I was an academic teaching in reconciliation and Indigenous studies. And in the last 10 years I've had more leadership roles at university. So at my previous university I was responsible for all reconciliation matters, and now at Federation I'm doing the same. And that's been an interesting journey in itself, to sort of look at some of the principles I've learnt over the years about what makes genuine reconciliation. I've always been a strong opponent of what I call a practical or performative reconciliation, which is sort of, I argue, performative reconciliation is about if all you're doing is having morning teas and wearing trendy t-shirts for reconciliation, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all you're doing, it's just not enough. So I've always been strongly advocating that for a genuine ally, you need to be acknowledging Indigenous rights. You need to stand up against racism. You need to stand up against, look for the importance of truth-telling in education. So what I found interesting after those 20 years of being an academic is taking those principles and then using them in my leadership positions to develop what I'd like to see effective reconciliation action plans. Many organisations have RAPs that aren't very effective, and we saw that during the referendum campaign. Really disappointingly, many organisations with RAPs failed to support a referendum, and I found that really strange. If you have a RAP, you should recognise the importance of First Nations voices in your own organisation. You then should understand the importance of a First Nations voice to Parliament. But I've been able to use some of those learnings I've developed over the years in my academic career to help try to produce meaningful reconciliation action plans and meaningful engagements in reconciliation. And in terms of the broader political discussions, yeah, there's been enormous change. But it's been interesting to see some of the standard things repeating themselves. One of the things I was really disappointed in last year's referendum was one of the big fear campaigns that the No case put up against the referendum was this idea that if the voice got up, suddenly non-Indigenous people would lose their land. I mean, just ridiculous comments. And that brought me back to what happened 30 years ago with the Native Title Act. Exactly the same sort of fear and hysteria. And to this day, not 1 square centimetre of private land's ever been returned to Indigenous people under native title because it couldn't. But that didn't stop those same sort of falsehoods being argued against. So lots of things have changed, but then some of those processes that we have to fight against are still there. In terms of reconciliation, what I sort of see is that the country's moved a long way in the last 30 years. I mean, you had reconciliation started in the 1990s, and now there's 5,000 organisations with RAPs. You've got about 50% of Australians studying or working in organisation with the RAP. Each state's now got its own reconciliation body. As you said, I have the honour of co-chairing Reconciliation Victoria. There's a lot of goodwill out there, but I think there's still a long way to go in terms of that education, that truth-telling process, and that's what the RAP organisations are really trying to do, is try to look at ways to engage the broader community in that education process and the truth-telling that we need in this country.
You mentioned the scaremongering during the campaigning, and I've been in the State Library of Queensland and I've looked through all of those cutting books as well, and seen all the old newspaper articles around people saying you'll lose your land if Aboriginal people have native title, and like you said, people didn't lose their land. So you think from that happening in 1992 to now 2024, and the same tactics are being used. What do you think about that?
Yeah, really disappointing, because they clearly work, and that's the sad thing, because we had 60% oppose the voice, and I've done a lot of analysis of what happened, and I talk about that in my new book on the voice, and a lot of it comes down to that ignorance, but also people believe some of the lies. And we heard some shocking lies. Like I talked to senior multicultural leaders who told me that members of their multicultural communities were being called by no campaigners to say if the voice got up, not only would they lose their land and not only would they pay more taxes, which both were complete lies, but they were also being told they'd be deported. So it says something about the political debate in this country that sort of lies were there. So that was really disappointing to see that we didn't, as a country, have the political maturity to have a rational discussion about what the voice is about. And I think we have to take those lessons from the referendum and really apply them, because many state governments are still looking at issues of voice, treaty and truth in their reforms. In Victoria, we've got the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is leading the work for a treaty. We've got the Europe Justice Commission, which is leading the work for truth-telling. And those are really important reforms. Other states are looking at similar sort of reforms. And we just need the broader Australian population to be more genuinely engaging in this process, to work towards what we see as a substantive reconciliation process, and not to sort of and fail to engage genuinely with what's actually occurring and the truth out there. So that's the thing I think we need to do as a reconciliation movement.
I agree. There's a lot that can be done. And you're a really fierce advocate for Aboriginal equality and recognition in this country. And earlier this year, on January 26, you were presenting a speech in Anglesea in Victoria, which didn't have the best outcome.
No, it was really disappointing. I got invited to speak, and they asked me what I'd like to speak about. So it was the Anglesea Lions Club invited me to speak, and I told them I'd speak about truth-telling. I gave them a list of all the publications that I'd written about, which, reparative justice and truth-telling and addressing racism. And I also listed some of the work I'd done over the last 25 years. So they could have been under no illusion about what I'd talk about. And I turned up to the event, and people walking around with Australian capes, Australian flags on as capes, and staring at me, quite shocked that I was wearing a Voice Treaty shirt. So I was a little bit apprehensive about what the reaction to the event would be. But I got up and spoke, and about halfway through, I talked about different countries around the world, and I analysed India and Canada, the United States and Australia, and talked about most other countries have their days of celebration, a national days of unity, and they talk, whether it's the country coming together because of a civil war or because of a war of independence, their days of unity. And I pointed out the contrast in Australia, because whatever you want to say about January 26, it's not a day of unity. There's clearly differences of opinions there. And I pointed out that contrast and talked about that for many people that day commemorates an invasion. And at that point, there was about 250 people. It was an outside event. Many of them started booing, which is very disappointing, very immature, really. But look, I've been booed before over 25 years. That itself wasn't surprising, but what really surprised me then was that the organiser approached to the microphone. I thought he'd say, look, this guy's our invited guest. He's driven, it's a 2-hour one-way trip from Melbourne to get there. Can you listen to him speak? But unfortunately, he told me in no uncertain terms that I had to stop speaking and get off the stage. I said, look, can I just finish my speech? And he said no, and he grabbed my arm and he pulled me away from the lectern and then made me walk through the crowd. And at that point, the crowd were screaming, swearing at me. I could not believe this was over one word. And they were extremely rude. At that point, when I was walking through the crowd, I really wasn't sure how the event would go. And I walked through the crowd, got to the end of it. A number of people from the crowd came up and said they were horrified at how I'd been spoken to. The MC came up and apologised. He said, I shouldn't have grabbed your arm, but you're being political. And I asked him what did he mean by that word political, because to me, on January 26, whether you're using the word invasion or colonisation or settlement, they're all political words. He just chose to prioritise one word. But yeah, it was an interesting experience. I then left and I reflected on that. And, you know, as I've said, Emma, in a number of these interviews I've had, it's really important for me to recognise as a non-Indigenous person that this is happening to Indigenous people all the time, often in far worse circumstances than it happened to me. So that's a really important point. But also to me illustrates something about the country after the referendum. I think, would this have necessarily happened before the referendum? I've heard lots of stories of people yelling during people's welcomes to country, of elders being yelled at when they do a welcome to country. And so to me, what's happened since the referendum, a small section of the population has extrapolated the results of a failed campaign and of a no vote and extrapolated that to attack a lot of the gains we've won as a reconciliation movement over many years. So but there's been big pushbacks against welcomes to country. I know there's councils in South Australia that have formally abolished welcomes to country. There's councils in Victoria that are now moving back to use January 26 as a day of celebration rather than avoiding activities on those days. So there is quite a bit of pushback going on. I think for those of us in the reconciliation movement, those of us there, we need to look at ways to help, you know, push back against that that reactionary force and to look at ways to have a, you know, civil debate in this discussion. Because one of the really disappointing things, Emma, I saw after the referendum was there was many people going around, both conservative and political commentators and politicians, saying that there was no racism in the referendum. And you just have to talk to any Aboriginal person in the referendum. There was enormous levels of racism. You know, one of our colleagues in the National Centre, as you know, an elder in his 70s was viciously verbally attacked on a plane when he just wore a Voice T-shirt. I know Aboriginal friends of mine, they took their kids out of school after the referendum because their kids were getting racially abused at school. So racism played a big part in the campaign, just like education, the lack of education did. So I think it's incumbent on those in the reconciliation movement to stand up against racism and to push back against this, to look at ways we can move forward as a country to a genuine reconciliation process.
What you're saying as well is it seems that after the referendum, people are sitting either in a pool where they're saying, oh, we want to do more and we want to help, or the people that never agreed with reconciliation, it's almost given them like some sort of ticket to say, oh, we don't agree with it and we're going to talk about it now and we're going to treat you like that. Would you agree? Yeah,
and in the former camp, I've got two hopes for the future. One is the leadership of First Nations leaders around the country. So in Victoria, it's the First Nations leaders that are leading us towards treaty and truth, and across Australia it's Indigenous leaders who are doing this amazing work. I'm still a strong advocate of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I still firmly believe in voice, treaty and truth. So that's given me a lot of hope, the work done around Australia. But the other big inspiration for me is the work of the local reconciliation groups. So there's lots of, either they're the old Yes 23 groups or the local reconciliation groups. I've been speaking to a lot of those groups in my book tours around the country for my book. And they're inspirational, the work that they're doing in fantastic local truth-telling work. You know, with the group, for example, in Inverloch, down in Victoria, they're instrumental with traditional owners in overturning the federal electorate down there. Used to be named after a Angus McMillan that had committed many massacres, and they got the Australian Electoral Commission to change that name to take that away. So there's just lots of examples like that. So to me, there's a lot of hope. We still had 6.2 million people who voted yes. We had tens of thousands of Australians who campaigned actively, one of the largest political campaigns. So to me, there's an overwhelming sense of hope with this, but we just still have to find ways to bring the whole community with us, because clearly what happened at Anglesey is just one example of what is happening with some of the reactionary comments after the referendum. And I agree with you. I think there's a real concern that people have sort of extrapolated those results from the referendum, and we need to look at ways to bring them on the journey with us as well.
So looking towards the future as an ally, how does it sit for you? What do you think that other allies should be doing in this space?
Well, they need to stand up against racism. I mean, I'm not advocating everyone has to get up and do a speech and get yelled at by 250 people, but in their own way. So if they're at a work event and someone says a racist joke, don't look to their Aboriginal colleague to say something. Go and say something themselves. So being brave, standing up against racism, looking at ways to amplify Indigenous voices. If you're working in an organisation with a rap, make sure the rap's meaningful. Does it go beyond the morning teas and the raising of flags, as important as they both are, but does it address looking at ways to have anti-racism practices in the workplace? Does it look at ways to have genuine cultural engagements in the workplace? So I think on a range of levels, and so what I've been saying to a lot of allies in Victoria is what we really need them to do is to step up, because very excitingly, Victoria is about to become the first state that will have a treaty. We're having negotiations at the moment between the First Peoples Assembly and the state government, and the treaty will probably be finalised in about May 2026, and we've got the next state election a few months later. So we really don't want that to get caught up in the political process. We can see what happened with the Voice referendum about when things get politicised. So we really need allies in Victoria and across the country to stand up for Voice, Treaty and Truth, to stand up for the Uluru Statement. And what that means is they need to talk to their friends, their neighbours, their colleagues. So I think having that really important criteria there. One of the things that really disappointed me during the referendum, as you know, there's so much colonial load in organisations anyhow in terms of that expectation that Indigenous people are going to carry this burden. That went into the stratosphere for the Voice, and I know at Federation University I had to send a couple of all-staff emails to say, look, if you want to learn more, go to our very comprehensive resource page. Don't hassle an Indigenous staff member who's just going to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee. Go and read about it. So to me, that's one of the biggest things allies can do, is learn more about Voice, Treaty and Truth, learn more about the Uluru Statement, which I really just have to reiterate is one of the most beautifully profound statements I've ever read. Such a generous invitation to the Australian people. And then educate, allies can then educate their colleagues, their friends, their families, and don't rely on Indigenous people to have to carry that burden all the time. I think that's one of the biggest messages for allies.
Absolutely. So you've written a book on the reflections of the Voice over the campaign and what it's like now. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, the first book that's been written in the aftermath of the campaign. And what it tries to look at is what are the key lessons from the Voice campaign, from the referendum, for our ongoing reconciliation journey. So I sort of pick out about 10 key signposts from the referendum, things that we've talked a bit about during this discussion: the importance of substantive reconciliation over performative reconciliation, the importance of standing up against racism, the importance of recognising Indigenous rights. A couple of the other things we haven't talked about that are in the book, I think it's critically important to recognise the importance of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also the key role of the reconciliation movement engaging more communities into their space. So, for example, if you looked at the voting data, the polling data, once you got out of the CBDs, the Melbournes and the Sydneys and the Perths, those inner city areas, the voting plummeted in outer suburbs and rural communities. And so the reconciliation movement needs to do much more to engage those communities. The other project, as you know from sitting on our board of the National Centre, is the work we're doing in Multicultural Australia. So we had this fantastic pilot program in Victoria, and we're looking at taking that nationally, where we work with multicultural communities to engage them in reconciliation. So there's lots of lessons, I think, and my book's just an attempt to try to kickstart some of these discussions about that, because I think the reconciliation process will continue, but we just have to learn those lessons from the referendum to see how we can progress voice, treaty and truth, how we can progress the Uluru Statement from the Heart coming forward.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining me for this discussion, and I'm sure all of our viewers really appreciated everything that you shared today. And thank you for being so open as well about your experiences with racism and how hard it has been for you in this journey. But more importantly, thanks so much for walking with us and supporting us, because the referendum wasn't an easy time, and unfortunately now in the aftermath it's even harder. So there's a long way to go, but there are a lot of good people out there doing amazing things, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Great to be on. Yep.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Paint It Blak. Thank you, Andrew, for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.